You all for joining us today. I'm Oliver Stover. I'm an associate principal at Charles River Associates, and I'm located in our Boston office. And today I was going to share the findings with you all on a recent report that we produced about the role of offshore wind in ISO New England and New York ISO. This is building off some work that we did previously, looking at the role of offshore wind in resource adequacy, more from a national lens. And in this case, we really dove in and looked quite holistically on the role of offshore wind in ISO New England and New York ISO. Recognize this is quite technical work, so I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you all and hopefully have the opportunity to address any questions and hear any feedback from various folks. Just about Charles River, we're an economic consulting agency that's based globally. We have a energy practice that has a footprint across the US, Canada, and Europe. We're quite experienced electricity resource planners and work with utilities across the country. That's my background. I'm an expert in resource planning and resource adequacy, and that's the lens with which I perform this work. If we get into the so what of what we found, we specifically chose to take an IRP style analysis, and this is looking at the grid holistically from a number of angles and also looking at how the grid works together. We found a number of items about the role of offshore wind. First, we found that there are quite material resource adequacy risks in New York City. This is important from the perspective of offshore wind because it can have a non-trivial impact on helping reduce some of those risks. The timing is a little ironic. Just saw very recently that New York ISO also published a report finding essentially the same thing. Did not inform our work, so does hopefully provide some credibility that both us and New York ISO are saying similar things. Are material risks in downstate New York. Offshore wind can play a critical role in help solving some of those risks. The second thing we found is that offshore wind portfolios that include it, working in concert with wider investments in onshore renewables, as well as dispatchable resources, they do provide typically across a number of metrics, material benefits. From an energy price perspective, from a reliability perspective, from an emissions perspective. When we dig into the capital cost perspective, performance was slightly more mixed. There were outcomes where offshore wind performed better than other resources, and others, particularly at very high penetration, where it was less competitive with resources like gas, which I'll discuss in further detail. We also found that the New England region is exposed to tightening markets region-wide, in Canada, in PJM, and this has material impacts, especially in New York ISO. But we did find that investments in native resources like offshore wind directly connected to key constrained regions can help mitigate some of those challenges. And lastly, we'll recognize that our model is dependent on our assumptions. So recognize that people could get different outcomes using different assumptions, though we're quite confident that our assumptions are generally quite durable. If we dig into exactly kind of the key elements of performance that we looked across in these markets, we looked at, okay, we're going to start with a base case with offshore wind and then look and see how well it performs compared to credible alternatives. And we looked across a number of aspects of performance to make sure that we are thinking about this holistically. First, from a resource adequacy perspective, we found that portfolios with offshore wind performed exceptionally well and could achieve performance similar to if we pivoted to a gas alternative. Next, if we looked at how portfolios performed on an energy perspective or a natural gas capacity factor perspective, no surprises. Portfolios that included either onshore or offshore renewables had the best performance. Similarly, that resulted in emissions performances as well. And lastly, if we looked at a capital cost perspective, the results were more mixed and more nuanced, and we tend to found that either building nothing kind of makes sense at the lowest capital cost, but may not be viable from a resource adequacy perspective. In portfolios where you do have to build something, gas or offshore wind typically had the best outcome, depending on the level, the build level, and other assumptions. When we dig into why we get these outcomes, specifically why offshore wind does appear to be competitive across a number of elements. First, we look at it just plays well in this kind of missing hour that we're seeing of key grid stress. So we're seeing emerging across the country, and really especially in New England, winter is becoming increasingly a period of great stress. We're seeing a lot of load growth in the winter due to electrification of heating and transit, as well as greater stress on aging fuel systems in these regions. And offshore wind just really well aligns with these periods of stress. That being said, it's not just a winter problem, especially in New York ISO. We still see some summer challenges continuing into the nighttime hours, and offshore wind is well positioned to augment wider solar builds and kind of filling in those hours where solar performs less well, especially summers during the night. Next, we see strategic siting locations. Because it's directly connected to some of the highest load and most stressed regions, it can get the best bang for its buck. So offshore wind is directly connected to New York City, which is the region of greatest stress that we found. So it has the greatest impact because it's directly linking to that stressed zone. However, another key finding from our report, which is augmented by other findings that have recently come out, we do find that both these regions need new resources to help keep up with the pace of load growth and retirements. So all megawatts are powerful and helpful, and every megawatt, different types of resources are each playing a different role in this grid. And lastly, we find that native investments, especially within these key stress zones, are best positioned to help mitigate, but not entirely prevent some of these challenges from region-wide tightness. When we started to perform this work, we wanted to get a background of kind of what's going on in the region, as well as to build off some of our findings from our previous studies. First, we placed a great deal of emphasis on resource adequacy, which is a key challenge across the nation, given load growth, aging infrastructure, and retirements that we've seen across electricity grids nationwide. And what resource adequacy means is having enough and the right type of generating resources to keep the lights on. And this historically was relatively simple because you could plan for a single peak hour, but it's becoming increasingly complex. And so we're looking at, do I have enough generation to keep the lights on if I have a planned or unplanned outage? If my renewables, if I have a renewables drought or variability in renewable behavior, if I have a long duration, very cold or very hot event, or if I have a common cause outage, such as stress on the fuel system. This is something that we placed a great deal of emphasis on and wanted to keep in mind as we did this assessment. Next, we wanted to think about this from an IRP style perspective. What does that mean? We know that there are really a lot of great popular intuitive metrics like levelized cost of energy that are often used to talk about an individual resource, or people will talk about a single element of resource planning. But we recognize that grids work as a whole, investments work as a whole, and we really wanted to think about this holistically because our intuition, which has borne out with our modeling, is that offshore wind in particular is fitting well into a slot that's kind of missing from the other generator resources and works well when combined with wider investments. So some of the facets we thought about and when performing our assessment is first, we wanted to be future looking. We wanted to make sure the grid is changing quite substantially, and we wanted to make sure we thought about the grid from the future and not just the past. Next, we wanted to make sure that we are thinking about this in a way that's actually buildable, or at least identify challenges in building certain new resources. We also wanted to think about, like I said, the grid as a whole and how technologies work as a whole. We wanted to make sure that we are building uncertainty into our thinking, a range of uncertain outcomes, uncertainty in weather, uncertainty in build, and so on. And lastly, we wanted to make sure our assessments were quantitative and we are balancing goals and thinking about the range of perspectives that an electricity grid has to handle. Some other factors that really informed our thinking is that we recognize that the fuel system is particularly stressed in the Northeast, particularly in New England. This means that many of the existing thermal resources are among the oldest in the country, particularly in New York, We also recognize that there's limited ability to add new electricity, natural gas generators because much of the existing pipelines are at their limit. Because of this, many resources are equipped with what we call dual fuel, which means that during periods of great stress on the natural gas fuel system, they'll flip to a backup fuel, commonly fuel oil. But this comes at a cost. It's more expensive, it's more emissions intensive, and it often places greater wear and tear on resources. So this really informed our thinking. We also recognize some work we had done previously that there's limited ability to add new resources on the pipelines. So one of the things we did is we looked at, is there enough headroom on existing fuel systems to add new generators? And we found that this ability was very limited. So if we look at how much more can we add, even as we free up fuel due to electrification, the ability is very limited. So for perspective, we can add perhaps a few more 100 megawatts of resources in New England, but for perspective, we're talking about a 6,000 megawatts of demand in the resource. So quite limited ability to add new resources. Recognize this might change into the future as we expand our fuel system, but there might be a timing mismatch that these investments might be too late to meet some of the near-term load growth. We also recognize that the resource adequacy challenges are material nationwide. We looked at a report produced by New York ISO, where they themselves have highlighted some concerns on resource adequacy, and specifically a shift toward more risk in the winter. So this is something we wanted to keep in mind as we performed our studies. We also wanted to place a great deal of emphasis on tightness region-wide. So we recognize that New York ISO, ISO New England really benefit and enjoy some great trade relationships with their partners markets. So Canadian markets, Hydro-Quebec in particular, PJM, both net importers, and have historically been able to leverage that relationship during periods of stress. But we recognize that markets nationwide and across the border are getting tighter, and this could create a situation where historically both these markets were able to import during periods of stress, but that may not be the case as they move forward and risk shift toward the winter. So that's something we really wanted to keep in mind as we performed this analysis. When we actually got into our modeling, I won't go into the exact details of all of the models, but we used a suite of interconnected models that holistically looked across the market and work together, and that are quite common resource planning methods. So first, we forecast for what does the grid look like for the future? So what new resources are going to get built? What's buildable? Where can it be built? And what are the policy implications of what's going to get built? From that base case outlook, which included a mix of onshore renewables, natural gas, and offshore wind, we thought about, okay, what would happen to these markets if they pivoted away or were forced to pivot away from these offshore resource plan? What could develop as an alternative? Using these various resource mixes, we were able to say, okay, how would they perform day to day? What would the energy costs be? What would the capital costs be? And then from there, we also performed more detailed analysis on what are the resource adequacy implications of how well these resources would perform under stress, and potentially how much during those stress conditions would they have to rely on this backup fuel. To dig into three aspects of our modeling in more detail, first, we didn't just assume if offshore wind gets canceled, nothing's going to develop. We recognize that that's one outcome. If offshore wind can't develop, the grid brings nothing. But more realistically, likely it would pivot to alternatives, as well as performing some of these counterfactual scenarios also helps us get an apples to apples comparison of what's offshore wind's role in the grid relative to credible alternative resources. So the first counterfactual scenario we examined was what would happen if we just took this resource away? And our goal here is to recognize that the market is planning for these resources, and many of them are quite advanced. And these aren't integrated markets, and it could take some time for an alternative to develop. So this is really just looking at what's the risk to the grid if we just don't build these projects and nothing is brought on as the alternative. Next, we wanted to look at, okay, well, we couldn't build offshore. What happens if we build onshore? And we just wanted to look at what is this benefit of going offshore? What are we capturing there relative to onshore resources? And lastly, the counterfactual scenario we looked at was what if we replace these resources with a gas resource, recognizing this is also a reasonable proxy for another type of dispatchable resource, perhaps like a DEFR. Want to highlight that I do think that net new gas resources is in the near term, as contemplated in the study, are challenging. New York and ISO New England are both challenging places to build for a number of reasons. They're expensive, they're coastal, they're quite dense, as well as having limited fuel. Many of those problems might be solved in the longer term. So do want to recognize that we are contemplating a future where net new gas resources might be built quite quickly, perhaps by 2032. But that might be challenging and something that folks want to keep in mind, resource planners in these regions want to keep in mind as they contemplate various plans into the future. From there, we looked at grid performance across a number of metrics, recognizing that electricity grids are often trying to seek a number of outcomes, and those outcomes are in conversation and sometimes in conflict. So the first thing we wanted to look at was resource adequacy. So how reliable are these grids? And we measure this using a popular metric, expected unserved energy. And this means, on average, how much energy couldn't be met by the grid. Ideally, we want to keep this zero, but very, very low. This is not an intuitive metric, so to make this more digestible, we divide it by the total energy and report this as a part per million. So this is basically saying what portion of total energy demand couldn't be met because I don't have enough and the right type of generation in the right location. We also looked at various cost elements to look at affordability, which is another key metric of grid performance and one of the real challenges facing our industry. And we looked at the energy cost as well as the net capital cost, sort of the two really popular metrics of affordability. We also looked at natural gas capacity factor, traditionally more of a metric of looking at cleanliness or emissions, which is another element of resource planning. But we also want to highlight that we think this is a really important leading indicator of reliability in these markets. Especially in New York, the fleet, while critical to resource adequacy, is aging. And if we place greater and greater strain on these resources, it could increase the likelihood that they retire earlier than we'd like. And it also could limit the amount of time that we have to take maintenance, and it could increase the need to take maintenance, ironically. So this is something we want to keep in mind as a long-term leading indicator of potential grid stress. And lastly, very traditional metric for sustainability, kind of another key element of resource planning, what's the emissions, to look at just the suite of reliability, affordability, sustainability as kind of the three traditional elements of resource planning. To dive into two of our models that are slightly more sophisticated, but are really critical to our analysis. The first is we performed loss of load modeling, which means that we shocked the system in a number of ways to look at how well it can keep the lights on across a wide range of conditions. So this is looking at, first we start from the same weather conditions, and there we say, in those weather conditions, what would the load be? What would the wind be? What would the solar be? And what would the outages be? This is really critical to get that each of those elements is internally consistent. So we're really looking at, okay, it's very, very cold. The thermal resources are more likely to have a common cause outage. The solar probably isn't happening because it's cold. Well, actually, wind might be blowing. That's important. Similarly, on the summer side, we want to recognize, okay, if it's very, very hot, that might go on for multiple days. Solar probably is shining. Wind probably is blowing, but less so, to really get an internally consistent scenario and stress a wide range of conditions so that we can help see how well these grids can maintain their reliability across a wide range of conditions and how these resources perform. Something we spend a lot of time thinking about is how these markets interact with other markets. specifically how well they can import from surrounding regions. So we ran two sensitivities to look at this. The first, we matched the way New York ISO models, where we allowed the region to import from surrounding regions and sort of assumed that that megawatt would be there, with the exception of Hydro-Quebec in the winter. However, we recognize that many of these regions are getting tight, in particular PJM. So we also ran a sensitivity where we assumed none of those imports were available, and these two markets just had to stand on their own. Really want to emphasize that's a very, very conservative assumption. In reality, it's unlikely that every time one of these regions were stressed, its neighbors couldn't help. We just wanted to understand what would be the impact on some of this ability to import going away, and what are these markets' exposure to tightening supply-demand conditions, and what is the role that native investment can play in hedging against this type of tightness. We also wanted to make sure that our analysis was future-looking. We recognize that load is growing in these regions, but it's really growing in the winter, and both of them are projected to go from what we call summer peaking, so having their peak demand in the summer toward winter. And this has real implications for the type of resources that we're talking about. Given that winter growth is really well aligned with when the wind is blowing. So this is something we wanted to make sure that we included in our modeling and thought through the implications of. And one of the major implications of this winter load growth is the use of backup fuels. So as I mentioned, both of these markets can get quite tight on the fuel systems because there's competing demand for building heating. So as a result of this, many traditional natural gas generators that are on natural gas most of the time will flip to their backup fuel, often fuel oil, when it's very, very tight. Because of this winter load growth, we hypothesize that this could happen quite a bit more frequently. We were able to find this really great study that had been performed by New York ISO, where they published a relationship between, okay, if this is the winter peak, how much fuel oil are we using? And we were able to use this relationship to examine the implications of, as we drive up load growth, how much more fuel oil would be used, and could offshore wind help prevent this? This is obvious emissions benefits. Fuel oil is more emissions intensive, as well as cost benefits. Fuel oil is more expensive. But one of the other factors we think it's important to keep in mind is that fuel oil, it's just harder on the unit. It can drive up fouling and coking. So this could have longer term implications on the long-term viability of some of these resources, and offshore wind potentially could prevent this. So in sum, we did a holistic, quantitative, kind of system-wide view on, I've got a base case outlook where I include offshore wind. What is a credible way that the market could evolve if offshore wind, if the markets chose to or forced to pivot away from building those resources? What are the reliability, affordability, and cost implications of having offshore wind versus credible alternatives? And how can I measure each grid's performance on each of those metrics using quantitative metrics to look holistically on each grid's performance? From our outlook, using our forecasting tools, we were able to look into the future and say, okay, this is the build out that we project is going to happen in New York ISO. We project a quite material build out of onshore and offshore renewables. We did not build any net new gas resources because of some of the challenges building gas in these regions. However, we did not retire any generation, recognizing that they've been highlighted as critical to reliability by New York ISO. From this base outlook, we developed credible alternatives. I report this for just 1 year. So we looked at, okay, base case, we've got a mix of onshore, offshore renewables, and natural gas and storage. As a credible alternative, I keep much of that base case, but I would say, well, what would happen if that offshore resource went away? So in the no alternatives case, we just said, okay, straight cancellation, offshore wind gets canceled, I can't build anything else. The renewables only, I would further pivot to onshore resources. Critically, we build these resources where they actually get built now. So this is upstate New York. So it's important to recognize that onshore resource is going to be further away from where it's quite needed. So this could have non-trivial implications on the transmission system. We do include some storage resources because of the way the New York ISO market is structured. It has local reserve margin requirements, so we honored that by putting some storage in New York City. In the gas-only alternative, we built equivalent gas resource on an accredited capacity basis, and we put this downstate. Certainly recognize that's not a trivial ask. Net new resources are difficult to build in New York City, particularly by 2032, though possibly more possible in the longer term, particularly as some of these investments in fuel systems in the region come to bear. Similarly, in ISO New England, we did the same thing, looked at what is the outlook for these regions. We project more offshore wind in line with the stated goals of this region, as well as a substantive build out in onshore renewables. And as with New York ISO, we don't add net new gas, but we don't retire any resources either. And similarly, we can look at what would happen in this market if it were to pivot away from offshore wind, recognizing that it could build new onshore renewables, but in sort of more outlying parts of New England, so more places like Vermont and Maine, especially for wind resources, versus if we were to do a gas only on an accredited capacity basis, we could try to put this where the load is, which is in the southeast part of the region and in Boston. To actually get into our results, I'm going to present on this slide, we'll present the outcomes for the 4 different counterfactuals that we considered. The base case is in gray, and that's the case that includes offshore renewables. The no alternatives case is in purple. That's the case where we say, okay, offshore wind projects get canceled, can't build anything else. Renewables only means I still have that base of gas and onshore renewables, but instead of that offshore resource, I further invest in onshore renewables, but in sort of outlying parts of region, versus the gas only case in blue is what if I pivoted to a gas resource. On many of these graphics, you'll notice that the no alternatives case might appear to be missing. It's because it's very well covered by the gas only case. These two performed quite similarly, so that's what's going on with this graphic. From here, we report the annual performance on each metric over the time horizon in our study, which is 2026 to 2044. If we look at our outlook for average energy in New York ISO, all 4 cases perform quite similarly in the initial years. But as we invest in offshore resources, the cases start to diverge. So initially, in all 3 cases, prices were slightly muted. However, if we were to pivot away from offshore, the outcomes diverge. In the case where I don't build a fuel-free resource, either onshore or offshore, prices start to drift back up again in the longer term. However, if I do build a fuel-free resource, often it drives down the marginal cost. It's able to maintain and stabilize energy prices. Similarly, if I look at the performance for gas capacity factor, no surprises, sort of somewhat similar performance, sort of stable usage of my gas resources. However, in the longer term, these fuel-free resources are able to displace some of that pressure on the gas system and able to drive down our usage of natural gas resources over time. But if I don't build those fuel-free resources, you see a much more muted decline. And this results in very analogous results from the emissions perspective. The additions of fuel-free resources is able to really drive down emissions over time, even as load is growing. While if I maintain some of those fuel-based resources, my decline is more muted over time. One of the more interesting outcomes we found is when we looked at the supplemental analysis that we did in New York, where we looked at the usage of oil-fired generation during those very cold events. So the first thing we noticed is, okay, what happens if I just have load growth in the winter, but I don't build any new fuel-free resources, new wind resources right in New York City to help drive it down? And we find that the amount of oil-fired generation could increase quite materially, up to 2.5% or 2.5x, which makes sense. I'm adding quite a bit of load in the winter, and that's concentrated on its coldest days because it's load due to electrification of heating. However, if we include that offshore wind resource, it's just quite well married to when those very cold events happen. So it can entirely prevent this uptick in fuel oil usage, which has quite material impacts from a number of perspectives. The other thing we found, in line with kind of why studies that have been performed elsewhere, that first megawatt is the most effective. And as we invest more and more, the direct impact declines. This makes sense. Basically, renewables sometimes are a victim of their own success. They're able to successfully shift periods of stress to hours where the wind isn't blowing. Doesn't mean that the offshore wind couldn't have a further role, but just that it would have to be paired with a storage resource so you can smooth out those wind lulls. And we do see that when we start to see this decline period, it's at a substantial capacity. So if we look at the 2036 case, we're talking the order of 4 to 5 gigawatts before we start to see this declining impact. Next, we wanted to look at when risk happened, especially in New York ISO. So I'm about to present some results where we say, when do we see load shedding events in New York? And how to read this metric is on the y-axis. I'll present months of the year. On the x-axis, we'll do hours of the day. And here we're going to present the sort of 99% worst outcome. Most of the time, load shedding is 0. This makes sense. The vast majority of the time, we can keep the lights on. However, if we start to get to this extreme event, sort of maybe the 99 or 99.9% worst outcome, we could start to see load shedding. And that's represented here as a redder color, and that means a non-zero load shedding event. So the more red, the more load shedding, not good. So if we look at our 4 potential counterfactual cases for 2032, we start to see, firstly, what happens if I build nothing? So I've got load growth, I've got increased stress on the system, I'm going to build some renewables upstate, but what happens if I don't build an offshore resource directly connected to downstate? And this is showing our load shedding risk specifically in New York City. We start to see load shedding risk. Specifically, this is even as the wider region gets more stressed during the winter. New York City remains stressed in the summer. Makes sense, that's its period of highest load. This aligns with studies that have been published by New York ISO that have also highlighted growing concern of load shedding risk, particularly if we don't invest in resources in New York City. However, what happens if we do build something? First, what happens if we build further onshore renewables, but upstate? This can definitely help. We see our red is less red, but it can't entirely solve the problem, partly because of limited transmission into the rest of the state. So we build the onshore solar or wind, but it's further out in New York. I can't import it to New York City. What happens if I build a gas resource? Here we see that the gas resource still has risk. This is probably due to the size of that gas resource. So if we build a bigger gas resource, we likely could get quite high performance. But include this as a recognition that if you don't build enough of a resource, it can't entirely solve risk. But lastly, if we look at this base case where we do include offshore wind directly connected to New York City, the risk almost entirely goes away. It's quite effective at solving the risk. We were somewhat surprised by this outcome because we think of offshore wind as being kind of a winter resource. So to see it have such an impact in the summer somewhat surprised us, but it starts to make sense. Even if it's generation, it's less, it's still there, and it's still directly connected into this region that has the greatest stress, so it can bypass some of the transmission congestion that we see in New York City. So that was one of our big findings, is that even if it's kind of time to shine is in the winter, it does appear that offshore wind has a role in preventing summer stress, and it can have a material impact in reducing some of this potential emerging risk in New York City. We also looked at where we found risk when we did our study. We found some risk in the western part of the state. This surprised us and was counter to some studies that we've seen from New York ISO. So this is likely due to a differing assumption on internal links within the market. Just important to think about, if we don't have enough transmission, even within the state, potentially we could have load shedding risk. However, we do find that the overwhelming amount of risk is downstate, New York City, Long Island, which really aligns with what New York ISO themselves have said. We also performed an additional sensitivity where we looked at what happens if we entirely cut off imports. So in our base case, we assumed we can import from Hydro-Quebec, we can import from Ontario, we can import from PJM. What happens if we assume that goes away? Extremely conservative, not meant to be a forecast, but really a sensitivity check. And we find that the risk would spread widely across the state. But the region that would be hurt by far the most is New York City. This makes sense. New York really benefits from some of those links with Hydro-Quebec. So it does count on the ability to trade with the wider region. If those regions get tight, native investment really helps prevent some of that. And if we actually look at our different risk metrics, again, reporting this as a PPM, where we're really targeting kind of that 20 ppm, both the bar charts in this case, the dark blue is our 2032 year, the light teal color is our 2036 year, and our circle is our sensitivity for the no imports case, and that is reported here on the right axis. So if we look at how well each of these cases do, we find that the base case, offshore wind, and the gas does the best in both years. This makes sense. You got a resource right where you need it in New York City. If we did not build anything, that would have the worst reliability outcome and would materially harm the resource adequacy situation in New York. So you need stuff in New York. If you did build those resources as onshore renewables, particularly outside of New York City, it would have an impact. It would still help the resource adequacy outlook, but not as well as resources directly connected to the strain zones, namely downstate. In all of our scenarios in 2032, we did find higher than we would like reliability risks, which is a concern. Longer term, we found that this system was able to stabilize, and as more resources came out to the system, it was able to effectively return to an acceptable risk level, and in which case, all the outcomes had more similar resource adequacy performances. If we flip to New York to ISO New England, very similar story, very similar results, though we did find that the variability across the 4 scenarios was wider, which makes sense because we assumed a greater amount of offshore wind in this market. So again, gray is our base case outlook with offshore wind. Purple is our no alternatives, where we just choose not to build anything. Green is our renewables only, where we build onshore renewables, and gas is our gas only replacement. If we are to build either offshore or onshore renewables, we're able to drive down prices. We did find here that even the renewables only case actually had the lowest prices longer term. However, if we don't build these fuel-free resources, prices initially decline, but then go back up as we rely more on fuel-based resources. As you'd expect, this is sort of direct similar story with natural gas capacity factor. The fuel-free resources are able to ease stress on our fuel-based resources, so kind of a nice synergy there. Versus in the longer term, a particular concern is this no alternatives case. We would actually have to increase our reliance on these fuel-based resources, which has material implications for their reliability, given that we could place more and more stress on our aging legacy resources, and put more and more stress on the fuel system, which has limited headroom in the New England region. Almost a 1-for-1 analogy when we look at the emissions. So as we'd expect, the addition of fuel-free resources is able to drive down emissions over time, versus we have initial progress in the case where the no alternatives or gas only case, but in the longer term, these emissions creep back up due to load growth. We found that the resource adequacy outlook was quite good in New York, in ISO New England, and there was minimal risk in 2032 or 2036, but it had some risk if we were to limit emissions. What this says to us is that probably our base outlook built too much stuff. And this could be either we're kind of building excess renewables to meet decarbonization goals, or the ELCCs are still evolving and we're going to sharpen that pencil and we'll end up building more resources. However, this is good news for ISO New England because it gives them more room if they are to have to retire some of these the natural gas resources, particularly as they get older, or if there's challenges in building new resources. We did project a substantial build of new resources. If any of those are delayed, difficult to build, can't get transmission, they've got more headroom. And we did find that offshore wind gives them the best bang for their buck from a reliability perspective of the fuel-free resources. When we did look at where we did see risk in this scenario with no imports, primarily in Vermont, makes sense, really closely linked with Canadian markets, so it would be harmed if it couldn't benefit from that relationship. With some risk in Boston, also as expected, given this is the highest load region and has some transmission constraints. Lastly, we wanted to put this all together and look at what are the cost implications. So we looked at a number of cost elements. So we looked at what are the energy costs. So how much is the whole market going to have to pay to buy its energy every hour? What is the net capital cost? So energy is only kind of one avenue for making money. These resources need to be made whole. So what revenue streams, recognizing that could be a capacity payment, a REC, or another out-of-market payment. We didn't break down those different revenue streams, but just said, okay, well, how much would they need to be made whole, including financing to make it work. And then lastly, we also include some sort of resource adequacy premium. If we look in New York ISO, we find that the base case and gas only have the best outcomes. And the base case with offshore wind actually has the best performance. It's able to drive down energy prices as a fuel-free resource, and it is competitive to slightly better performance on a capital perspective because you get at a relatively lower penetration, better megawatt per megawatt performance, and it's actually competitive with a gas resource. Renewables only had higher costs because you had to build more stuff. Because you get lower capacity factors for onshore renewables, you had to build more of it to keep pace with the offshore equivalent. So you ended up having to pay a premium on the capital side. The no alternatives case makes sense. If you don't build something, you don't have to pay for it. It's cheap. However, in New York, this wasn't a viable option because this resulted in quite poor resource adequacy performance. And while we didn't model the capacity prices, it would also drive up capacity prices quite materially. So the no alternatives case really isn't viable, and we see this base case or gas only case has the best cost performance. In ISO New England, recognize that all of these portfolios, you probably would end up building less stuff, so you would get a different outcome. We still see that this renewables only case is the most expensive, which makes sense because of this overbuild premium. Here we see, if we kind of put aside the no alternatives for a moment, the gas only has the best performance, even though it has higher energy costs. You have to build less resources to get the equivalent properties. This is important kind of implications as we think about the long-term viability of offshore wind, recognizing as they get really high penetration. Here we are talking about 18 gigs, so very deep penetration. It becomes less effective per megawatt. So in the longer term, not this first or probably even second tranche of investments, to kind of continue these results we saw in New York ISO, offshore wind could look to pair with storage to improve its per megawatt capacity, or look to get learnings from economies at scale to continue its cost competitiveness on a capital perspective with gas. So if we kind of get to what we found that winter load growth is a problem in both these markets. It can drive up costs. It can place more strain on fuel systems. We also recognize that there are still summer challenges, particularly in New York City. And we did align with New York ISO that there are non-trivial resource adequacy challenges coming to downstate New York. We use this kind of offshore IRP holistic market-wide, looking at how the whole market works as a whole using quantitative metrics to look at how offshore wind performs relative to credible alternatives. We found that offshore wind had quite good performance across a number of metrics. It was able to drive down energy prices. It was able to drive down emissions, as well as it was quite resource adequate relative to alternatives. We also found that particularly at this kind of lower investments, it was competitive on a capital cost basis. And while it had other savings, longer term at deep penetration, the capital cost performance less competitive with gas. And we one of the kind of big things we would recommend based on this study, we recognize that other elements of cost weren't included. In particular, cost that would have to be required to upgrade fuel systems on the gas side, as well as transmission costs on the offshore wind side. And we are using national cost figures and recognize these can vary quite materially locally. So that's one big recommendation that we would have for folks as they compare offshore wind to other alternatives to make sure they're really thinking through those local costs. And the other big recommendation that we would have coming out of our study is that these regions are tight. They really benefit from trade with each other, but recognizing that thinking through the region-wide tightening conditions might be important, and further collaboration to make sure that we're maintaining resource adequacy and affordability across the entire region. With that, thank you for listening and be happy to take any questions. Sorry, Dean, would you mind sharing any questions we have from the chat? Sorry, apologies, folks, having some technical difficulties here.
Oliver, do you hear me now?
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Okay,
Yes. Okay, happy to
sorry
hear any
about that.
questions.
Let me go over to my speaker system. Okay, the first question we have here is with respect to the energy storage scenarios. If you don't mind paging back to the build-out scenarios by region. The question we received is, have we looked at energy storage as part of the potential build-out of scenarios, and why did we keep energy storage at 0 for all ISO New England scenarios?
Um, Sorry, Dean, you're a little faint, but yes, we definitely included in the base case quite a bit of storage. So we do include storage in that scenario. Um, we also included storage in the New York ISO scenario to satisfy the local reserve margin requirements. But no, we did not do a just storage only scenario. Yeah, recognize that that is potentially an area of future study that others could look at as well. Recognizing as long as we've got energy to charge the storage resources, yeah, it could be an interesting alternative.
Okay, sorry, I just figured out the issue with my headset, so I'll continue on here. The next question we have is, were we looking at the impacts associated with specific offshore wind projects getting built or not getting built? If so, which projects, or did we consider the full build out of the New York and New England wind lease areas?
We didn't tie our we weren't looking sort of name by name, project by project, and we're really looking more longer term as the kind of technology as a whole. So I'll flip to a slide where we kind of looked at the resource mix as a whole. So we were really looking at quite a substantial amount of offshore wind that potentially could build just technology wide. Do recognize though and appreciate that the challenges to get to this level of investment, you have to get through those individual named projects. So recognize that some of the individual challenges we're talking about is exactly what we're contemplating here of what would happen if some of those resources don't actually come onto the market.
Okay. Next question here that we have in the list, the Vineyard Wind and South Fork projects have been sending power over to the grid. How is that factored into the energy prices costs uh, this year, and how do you expect it to factor into costs for consumers and grid operators in 2026?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We did include those two projects in all scenarios. So projects that are already online were already included, which is reflected in our initial energy costs. You'll notice do decline. That includes some of those fuel-free resources coming online. So yeah, thank you for asking that and for that clarification. If it's built, if it's on the system, we included it in all scenarios.
Right, so that would factor into the
Uh,
forecast we presented. Yep.
Absolutely. Yep.
Next question here is, can you share more on how you define local dynamics and learning rates?
Certainly an important study, but outside of the scope of this study and something we think is important, which is why we highlighted it. We are really looking resource wide as a whole. How do these technologies work together? Less on the specifics of each named project or each named challenge.
Okay, I guess that there's a follow-up question on the storage. So acknowledging that we included storage in the base case as projected. Um, I guess the question is, do we consider any advancements in storage? I think mostly maintaining the current mix. Oh, I'll let you answer that question, Oliver.
I actually don't remember off the top of my head. I am assuming that we include some longer duration, 8 hour, 24 hour in the future. Yeah, feel free to email me. I'm happy to share the details. I typically we do. I don't think we have 100 hour currently in this outlook, but certainly personally a passion of mine. I certainly think 100 hour could be an interesting application, especially when pairing with offshore wind as kind of quite a good fit.
Okay, next question is, what offshore wind price did you assume in your cost analysis?
We use the kind of public study from NREL, and it's the exact details are reported in our study.
Okay, next question is, how did we treat the upfront capital costs of offshore wind and the cost reductions provided by offshore wind?
Yeah. So
I,
that's a great question, and certainly what informed our net capital cost forecast. That's definitely something we you had to pay for the upfront capital cost, and then we enjoy the benefits of the that paid dividends on driving down the energy price, and that's how we got both of those aspects of it. So the upfront capital cost higher than gas typically, but you get that good savings in the forward of getting the energy price savings, and that's how we're able to formulate our forecast. But we also have upfront costs from gas too, as well as financing costs, and we included both of those when we did our net capital cost forecast. Oh, and onshore renewables. Apologies. Yeah, all of them. Upfront capital cost and financing costs that we included
right.
both of them.
Yeah. Next question is, how do capital costs um, impact costs to consumers? Does that lead to higher electric bills in the short term? I think I could take that one. So it depends. There is a interplay between the capital cost of a project and the benefits it can provide a system. With the unit like offshore wind, because it's fuel free, it's providing very low volumetric, from a volumetric perspective, very low cost energy. There's no fuel cost to it. That capital cost does get allocated over time and it depends on which region and how the costs are ultimately passed on to customers. If in New York, for example, NYSERDA issues the contracts and that ultimately does filter onto the customers, but the customers do feel the impact or the benefits via the energy costs and both the two components, energy and capacity cost, that do get socialized to the grid. So in terms of the short term, costs aren't typically recovered until the units are online in these markets. And then once they're online, then they're financed over a longer period of time or term, typically 20 years, and that's typically the duration of these offtake agreements. So the benefits are aligned with the costs. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Oliver. Hopefully we
Nope.
answered your question. It looks like that takes us to the end of the questions we've received so far. Any other questions? Oh, sorry. There are questions that were received via chat. I was looking at the Q&A uh, uh, window here, so I'm going to look at the chat now. Apologies for missing some of those other questions. Would these slides be available? Yes, we'll make the slides available. We'll
If
email.
you email us, we're happy
Yes.
to share them with you directly. They aren't listed with the report, but yeah, feel free to email us and we're happy to send them to you.
Okay. Question here is risk slides look like zones A, B were the most stressed, but you said it would be New York City. Isn't that zone J?
It is, in fact, Zone J. Oh, golly. Apologies. Two colors got repeated. It's Zone J. That light blue is in fact Zone J.
Yep.
Um, yeah, thank you for catching that and that clarification.
And then how material were load growth assumptions on data center development in New York ISO or PJM?
We matched the most recent Gold Book um, outlook from New York ISO, recognize that that might go up and there might be some data center growth in other parts of New York State. I personally don't see New York State having the same type of load growth that we've seen in PJM. But the data center problem does, even if it's not directly in New York, which there's going to be some, it materially impacts New York ISO, particularly given its close links with PJM. And the situation of PJM is quite serious, given the material amount of data center growth we've seen in that market.
Okay, so gonna answer only those questions we can within the purview of the study, and then let's just take a look here. Who do we have an email address that folks can reach out to?
Yeah, I'm sure we'll follow up via email and share my contact information. You can also always find me on LinkedIn, Oliver Stover, and yeah, feel free to reach out directly. Happy to answer questions, hear feedback. Just happy to hear from others.
Yes, thank you. And we'll share these an email after the webinar as well as the recording. So you'll get more information within the next day.
Okay, we do have one last question I want to entertain here. I know we're running out of time. Why were emissions lower for the base case versus renewables? Oliver?
Yeah, that it's sometimes it's just about timing. So even though we replaced the renewables on an energy only basis, it's about when things line up. And because the offshore wind has generation all the time, kind of it's up and down, but typically across all hours, it can help cover some of those hours that are harder to get with onshore renewables alone, recognizing that some of that problem can be solved with storage.
Okay.
So solar, it's in the day, not at night. That's kind of the obvious one, though it has good synergies as we get to pairing with offshore. I think you could tweak these numbers. I'm sure you could make it work to get that balance of kind of generation across all hours so that we can drive down the natural gas capacity factor to get at this just alignment with, you need generation all the time to relieve the stress that we're seeing on the thermal resources, which would result ultimately in the emissions.
So very,
Recognizing that, yeah, partly this outcome is our assumptions and we could tweak them, but that's kind of the key challenge there.
so very much timing driven. Well, thank you
Yeah,
very
wonderful.
much. Thank you, Oliver. Thank you all for participating in today's webinar, and we look forward to any feedback and questions. So thank you. With that, we'll go ahead and end today's discussion. Thank you.